A few weeks back, a synagogue of all places turned from a sanctuary to a house of horrors. Two Palestinian cousins with a gun and butcher knives attacked during morning prayers. 4 rabbis and a policeman are now dead. So was it blood libel that incited this, as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu deemed it? The unrest is centered around Jerusalem. Is this a case of a nationalist identity crisis or just the brink of an inevitable religious civil war? Returning to On Point to share his perspective is international relations expert Philippe Assouline. Welcome back, Philippe.
Hi, Tomi. Thanks for having me again.
So what now? Is there hope for peace in Jerusalem?
The prospects seem bleak, I'll admit. There is a level of tension I don't remember in at least since the Second Intifada. That means about 15 years ago. There's a lot of heated rhetoric on the Palestinian side. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is correct that the constant incitement is really a problem. And a lot of it came from Hamas after the war ended in August. And on the Israeli side, there's a lot of lack of patience. There was perhaps more patience in the past and a lot more anger. And that's not helping either.
So you had mentioned before the provocation by Hamas and the Palestinian side. What are they doing? Prime Minister Netanyahu called it blood libel. So is it just speaking fiery rhetoric, or what is it that you believe is provoking these actions?
I think the most damaging thing is the religious rhetoric. This started a long time ago. It started with Yasser Arafat taking control of Palestinian media around 1994-95. And there's been a steady and increasing diet of, I won't call it incitement, that's a vague word, of racism being taught in the schools, but couched in religious speak. So the libel would be, for example, that the Israelis want to destroy the mosques on the Temple Mount, that the Israelis are poisoning Palestinians, that the Israelis are poisoning candy to the children, all kinds of libels. But the worst, the most damaging, I believe, is about Jerusalem and threats to the holy places of the Muslims, which are not substantiated. They're false accusations. And Fatah, the party of Mahmoud Abbas, has also made a lot of these claims.
So is there any truth to this, though? Is Israel in any way encroaching on the site and making the Palestinians nervous in this way? Does Israel take any blame for these recent occurrences?
I think in any situation, both parties can improve their behavior. And the Israeli politicians now are criticizing some of the members of parliament who've gone on to the Temple Mount to pray. But you have to recall that the Temple Mount, this is where the temple was, where Jesus preached, is the holiest site in Judaism. And all that's being sought here is for private groups of Jewish people to be allowed to pray. Presently, the Palestinian authorities on the Temple Mount forbid Christians or Jews from praying, from even approaching the Dome of the Rock. This is actually a change. So to call it a provocation to just want to pray or even get close to the Dome of the Rock, which was the status before the Second Intifada, I think is a bit dishonest. And it's been used in the past to inflame tensions because this is such a potent symbol. But it's not, no, it's not true.
Is there Philippe, is there any hope that this area can be shared in the future, or is that completely off the table at this point?
Yes to both. I am conducting research into attitudes in the Palestinian community as to what would make it more acceptable for them to share that area. There are other areas that are shared, even though it's tense. There's religious interpretation that would allow both parties to pray there, to share the space. It's definitely not incommensurate with Islam by default. It is not incommensurate with Judaism. There definitely can be sharing, but right now, the way the narrative is in the Palestinian community, and unfortunately on both sides, it's unthinkable. Every single Israeli presence on the Temple Mount is seen as a provocation. And you have to remember that when Israel offered the Palestinian statehood and the division of Jerusalem, including of the Temple Mount in the year 2000 and early 2001, Yasser Arafat rejected those offers that would have created the first state of Palestine, and he cited the religious dimension of Jerusalem as an impediment. So yes to both your questions, unfortunately. It's possible, but not right now. There needs to be a change of attitude.
Both sides would have to come to the table, and that seems increasingly impossible right now because of all the violence. I want to return to talking about that because it seems that the region is heating up once again, involving these recent murders. Now, Hamas didn't take responsibility, but they didn't necessarily deny it either. So, in your opinion, from what you can tell, is this recent violence, is that lone wolves that are just taking up the ideas of the state, or is it in fact state-sponsored terrorism?
It's a very good question because Hamas knows now that when it claims responsibility for something, there are consequences. The war this summer started essentially when Hamas was found to have kidnapped 3 young boys and killed them, 3 young Israeli boys. I can't say that it's a lone wolf. I mean, to the extent, was Malik Hassan, who did the Fort Hood shooting, a lone wolf? It's a vague term. There is a systematic indoctrination, and there are more and more of these attacks. They've been happening very frequently in the last few weeks. And you might have seen on TV Palestinians celebrating these murderous attacks, like the synagogue attack in particular, people dancing in the street, a bit like there was celebration in Gaza after 9/11. Does that qualify as a lone wolf? I don't know. There was a claim of responsibility for PFLP, but I think to call it a lone wolf would be to not do justice to the broader problem of indoctrination. I think these people are victims of a system that teaches them hatred.
So what should Israel do in response? Because Netanyahu vowed to respond and to respond with force or to respond in an appropriate way. But what kind of response can Israel make without inciting another uprising? Because they have to tread very lightly here so that we don't enter another crisis like we saw this summer.
Absolutely. I think it should be a twofold approach. And I don't think Netanyahu has sufficiently addressed one of the sides, but President Rivlin, the new president of Israel, has. On the one hand, you do need deterrence, and you do need a tough hand against terrorism because you have to protect the innocent. There was a 3-month-old girl who was killed recently by a Palestinian driving a car into a crowd, these rabbis. On the other hand, just to use force is not enough. President Rivlin has been giving a number of speeches to the Israeli Arab community where he assures them that Israel is not at war with Islam. And he speaks to them in a tone that they can relate to, that addresses their concerns. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these concerns are based on false propaganda, but they're concerns nonetheless. And I think you need both approaches. You need to open some kind of a dialogue where you address the emotional and psychological concerns that people have, but also to have a heavy hand with terrorism. But if the constant indoctrination, which is funded by Western money, essentially in aid to the Palestinians, if that indoctrination doesn't stop, nothing will help.